Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with a skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. On Thursday, March 25th, we'll have a virtual program on the groundbreaking 1982 case, Mississippi University for Women v. Hogan, which opened the door for men to attend the first public women's college in the United States, and also set a precedent in future gender discrimination cases that eventually led to the admission of women to the Virginia Military Institute in 1996. Panelists will include attorney Wilbur Colon, who represented the plaintiff, and Nora Roberts Miller, the 15th president of Mississippi University for Women. You can find details on the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum Facebook page. And remember that we post the videos of all our streaming programs on the Mississippi Department of Archives and History YouTube channel. I hope that you'll join us next week for History is Lunch when our old friend Ralph Eubanks will discuss his new book, A Place Like Mississippi. We're here today for Richard Gruber's presentation on Dusti Bongé. But if you are fortunate enough to be in Jackson between now and May 23rd, treat yourself to the Mississippi Museum of Art's special exhibition, Piercing the Inner Wall, The Art of Dusti Bongé. That exhibit showcases her paintings, drawings, and sculpture, and you can find details on hours and admission at the museum's website, msmuseumart.org. J. Richard Gruber is the author of the New University Press of Mississippi book, Dusti Bongé, Art and Life, Biloxi, New Orleans, and New York. He is Director Emeritus of the Ogden Museum of Southern Art in New Orleans. Gruber served as Director of the Wichita Art Museum, Director of the Memphis Brooks Museum of Art, Deputy Director of the Morris Museum of Art, and Director of its Center for the Study of Southern Painting, and co-director of the Peter Joseph Gallery in New York. He's written numerous books and essays about Southern art and artists, and we're delighted to have him with us today. Rick will join us via Zoom, and he will take questions from the audience after his presentation. You can ask those questions in the comments of this video, and I'll pass them along to him at the appropriate time. Now, welcome Rick Gruber.
Greetings from Louisville. And good to be here with you today and to be presenting a program like this with you, Chris, at the time of the show there in Jackson, which is a very important exhibition curated by Bradley Summerall at the Ogden Museum. Brought together many of the most important works by Dusti Bongé. And what I hope to be able to do today is to add some background and some history about Dusti, about her art, about her connections to the coast. So I think what I'd like to do is to start with the first image, if that's working properly.
It is.
And look at the actual cover of the Dusti Bongé book. And what I'd like to point out, spend a moment on this cover, because what we're looking at is Dusti Bongé in Biloxi in a photograph taken by her son Lyle Bongé, who was a very noted photographer himself, about 1958. And above her, you see the painting, a very important painting of a sunflower dream number 1 from the same period. Lyle was her only son, and Lyle also was tied to Biloxi with his photography and with his career in many respects. Dusti was about 55 years old in this photograph, and we see her posing at the prime of her life with one of the major works from a period that was very important. I'd like to maybe underscore the fact that she is there in a very exotic, tropical-looking place. It's Biloxi. It's not New York. It's not the New York art world. It's a very different place, and I think that was very conscious, both from Dusti and from Lyle, and showing that while she was tied to New York, she was of the New York art world and doing well there. She nevertheless was really from the South, from the Gulf Coast. And this was her home, and this is where she was inspired. Dusti was unique, I think, in terms of, again, looking at the cover, Her ties were to Biloxi, but also to New Orleans and New York. And in the book, that's a big part of the theme that runs through this. Excuse me. Dusti was born in 1903. She died in 1993. So in essence, she lived through most of the 20th century. This book is about her life. It's about Biloxi and the Gulf Coast in the 20th century. It's about her career from 1936 to 93, her art career. She had an acting career prior to that. And it's about the interconnected worlds of both New Orleans and Biloxi in terms of the art worlds. It's also about the families, the Dusti Bongé family particularly. Dusti herself, her husband, Archie, was an artist. Her son, Lyle, was an artist, and her grandson, Paul, is an artist. So that's 3 generations of family that are being discussed as part of this as well. And in the book, I consider as well the art world in New York from the 20s to the 70s, which was the different points in which she was most connected. The book itself was published by the Dusti Bongé Art Foundation. I'd like to thank them for their support of the book and the research. It's distributed by University Press in Mississippi. Happy to be working with the press again. And designed by Philip Collier Design in New Orleans. Philip Collier and Chris Williams did a great job on this book. It was a major collaboration. Many images. The book is 354 pages, 500 illustrations. They had a lot of work to do. And in the context of books, there was only one book previously published on Dusti, this one in 1982, Dusti Bongé, The Life of an Artist, done with a great deal of interaction from Dusti. She was approaching 80 years old at the time this book came out. It was also created at the time of a film with educational television there in Mississippi. So both a book and a film came out in 1982. Again, she's about 80 years old. And I guess the assumption was then that this would be pretty much a summing up of her career and she would probably take it easy and retire. Well, as you'll see shortly, she did anything but that. But this 1982 book was the only real major source on her. So there was a need for a new book and new publication. And there's also been a rising interest on the art of women, especially abstract expressionist women. My slides are not exactly doing what they're supposed to. This is a view of the installation at the Ogden Museum. Again, Bradley Summerall's installation was very elegant and shows the scale of the show and also the scale of Dusti's paintings. If you look on your left, you see a self-portrait of Dusti. We'll talk about some of her self-portraits in a moment, but you see that version of what she calls a self-portrait. And then on the right, you see basically an image of Dusti looking down at her legs and her feet and her floor. And that's what she calls a self-portrait by the early 1940s. So part of what we see happening very quickly is Dusti moves into the art world and becomes very quickly drawn into the world of abstraction and to moving away from the specific reality of the world that had attracted specifically her husband, Archie. And here again, looking at the Ogden Museum installation, you can see the sense, you can sense the scale of the paintings as she moves into the 1950s and the 1960s in what was her peak period and her peak New York period. On the left is a painting called Windows, and the right painting called Portrait of B. That's a portrait of her friend and dealer, Betty Parsons. The background image, you get a glimpse of that, is one of the void paintings. A quick aside here, the current issue of Smithsonian Magazine has an article about this exhibition at the Mississippi Museum of Art and about the book. And the writer of that article interviewed me and had questions about Dusti, including questions like, why is she important now? Why should we know about Dusti today? And the question came up too, was she perhaps not well known because she was from the South? That question has come up many times. So I mentioned Dusti's deliberate decision not to move to New York. She had, in fact, had lived in New York already, but in the 50s, she was invited to move there. She chose not to. She chose to stay in Biloxi. And she wanted to stay in touch with the place that was her place, that was Biloxi and the Gulf Coast. The article in Smithsonian Magazine ends with this quote from me. quote, that's a strong tradition in the South, that connection to place. She traveled the world, but Biloxi was really her world. And that is really where I want to start our story today, and that is moving to Biloxi and moving to this view of Shell Road, Biloxi Shell Road, about 1901, 1902, about the time Dusti was born. And we're going to pause for a moment and really look at this, because it strikes me as just how different the city that we see today is compared to this time when she was born. Of course, there's a highway here now, there are casinos here now. There's a whole different world of visuals compared to what she grew up with. In the distance, you can see the lighthouse. You watch this winding road path made out of oyster shells. You see the piers out into the Gulf. You see seating areas around a tree. You see carriage. You see picket fences. You see a very interesting turn of the century view. This is from the west side of Biloxi, looking towards the lighthouse, looking east. She lived about the same distance on the other side, on the west side of it. And again, to me, being from here in Kentucky, I didn't grow up seeing oyster shell streets and roads. I didn't think that was the norm, but there she did. And there were so many oysters, so many oyster shells, they became literally part of the landscape. She grew up with these views. She grew up with that lighthouse, which obviously is still there, survived all sorts of hurricanes and storms. So we'll talk a bit about Biloxi and its history kind of quickly as well. Founded by the French in 1699, in the antebellum era, the steamboat era, these views are what attracted people who came to what were known as the Six Sisters on the coast, stretching from Bay St. Louis to Pass Christian to Mississippi City to Biloxi, on to Ocean Springs and Pascagoula, bringing and attracting wealthy planters and New Orleans residents to the Gulf Coast. Railroads came about 1870 to connect this scene to New Orleans. So Biloxi to New Orleans by 1870. By 1880, Chicago and other northern cities had direct access to the coast. So the tourism and resort aspects really grew in the 1870s, especially after the 1880s. And by 1903, when she was born, despite the way this looks, it was a very advanced, technologically advanced city on the coast. By 1893, downtown was electrified. By 1897, there were electric trolleys there. By 1899, there was telephone service between Ocean Springs and Biloxi. In 1900, there was an automobile sighted in Biloxi. In 1904, the city had its first registered automobile. And they even had a speed limit established by 1905. It was 8 miles an hour, pretty high speed limit. Also during the 1880s and 90s, perhaps most importantly, ice-making machinery and new mechanical canning processes were introduced that changed the nature of the economy and industry in Biloxi. As a result, by 1903, the year of Dusti's birth, Biloxi had replaced Baltimore as the seafood capital of the world. So all of that is background to this photograph and this time when she was born. So we'll move through the book using some of the chapter introductions and the periods that we discuss. Here are the early years from 1903 to 1919. And on your left, you'll see an image of Dusti's house on West Beach Boulevard. This house was crucial to her childhood years and most of her later life as well. And if you look below that on the bottom left, you'll see a postcard view looking out from the White House Hotel, which is almost quite literally next door to Dusti and her family. The White House is a famous resort, but what I found intriguing is that looking from the porch of the resort, you see pretty much what Dusti saw. You're looking at the same view of the Gulf, of the pier, of the sailboats that Dusti and her family saw from their own front yard, their own front porch. You also see the trolley that connected Six Sisters resorts along the coast. I want to thank here the Department of Archives and History for a great deal of help in this project. These two images, the trolley and on the right, the downtown view of Biloxi, come from your collections. And the staff were a great deal of help for us in putting these images together and bringing them into the project. This is the house today on Beach Boulevard, restored after Hurricane Katrina. This area was hit very hard by Katrina. and the Swetman family still live there. The Swetman family restored it, but this is a house where Dusti was raised. Has been part of the family for over 100 years. Her grandson, Paul Bongé, can be seen in this image on the front porch. And if you stand or sit on the front porch today, this is what you see. Looking across 2 yards, maybe 100 yards at the most, you see the White House Hotel. So when you think about the White House, which is certainly a famous resort hotel in Biloxi across the South, this was her neighbor. And she could literally hear the music and the voices and the crowds, including music from New Orleans musicians who played there regularly for the crowds, and she could hear the ballroom and the dining room areas. The White House Hotel, established in 1895, began as a series of houses, about 6 Victorian houses, became unified into a complex with these Corinthian columns, and became a real attraction for the city. Many tourists stayed here over the years, many of them from Chicago. This small cottage was next to the main house. It was moved there when their main house was being constructed. And Dusti lived here from the 60s until her death in 1993. Sadly, it's no longer there. It was destroyed in Hurricane Katrina. And one thing that was notable to me and is notable to any visitor to Biloxi is that this is an empty lot now, and there are many empty lots in Biloxi, and there are many reminders of what used to be there in Biloxi. Young Dusti on the beach in front of her house. She had a remarkable childhood. Her father was a banker. She certainly lived a charmed life in those days, and she had access to all of this part of town and moved freely in what was then a relatively small town. Her father was as mentioned, a banker. We see in this family sort of assemblage of family imageries from the photographs. Her father in the upper left standing together, Dusti and her father, O.G. Swetman, the banker. We see down below that same photograph of Dusti, we see her mother and her brother and her sister, Glenn and Catherine. And we see a Biloxi Back Bay boat launching ceremony, dedication. Boat building was big business in Biloxi, and Dusti was involved in that launch of that boat that day. But there's another side to the city, and it was related to fishing, to canning, to the seafood industry, and to the factories and the fleets that were there. It was a very culturally diverse city, almost literally the other side of town from where she lived. You see the fishing fleets, you see the brands, Dunbar and the canned shrimp and oysters. And below you see a Lewis Hine photograph of child labor, child workers, a 1911 photograph that suggests some of the more complex sides of life in Biloxi, an industrial city, one that had a very diverse population, including Italians, Greeks, Cajuns, African Americans, Polish, and Yugoslavians, working and living and becoming part of the culture there. Downtown Biloxi, postcard view, the People's Bank in the foreground. This was her father's bank, and not that far away, walking distance. But lots of postcard images of the city. It was a resort city, and it was a very accomplished city in terms of promoting itself and drawing people there. But, excuse me, my machine. The complexity of the city also is suggested by I apologize, I don't know what's happening here. The complexity of the city is evident with somebody like George Orr, who had this facility, the George Orr Pottery and Studio, just down the street, a few blocks from her father's bank. George Orr above with that famous mustache, known as the Mad Potter of Biloxi, a real character and a really talented potter who's now celebrated in the Orr O'Keefe Museum there in the city. Orr himself brought a great deal of attention to the city, and in later years has done so as much. Their lives overlapped. He died in 1918. She went to high school until 1990. She saw him actually riding his motorcycle by her house, mustaches flapping in the breeze. In 1919, Dusti went to college at Blue Mountain College in North Mississippi. Her goal was to become an actress, and she was set and determined on that. But her father wanted her to go to college, so they reached an agreement. She would go to a 4-year college, graduate, and then she might be able to discuss being an actress. So she went to Blue Mountain, which is a charming campus and a charming school, spent some time there doing research on this. And as you can see from these images and photographs, postcards, it almost looked like a resort itself. Large wooden buildings, porches, verandas, students on the lawn in the mountains of North Mississippi. She was very determined as a young woman and throughout her career. So much so that she graduated from Blue Mountain College in 2.5 years, taking summer courses and taking as many classes as she was allowed to do. She finished, her parents allowed her to pursue her acting career, and she went to Chicago on her own with no real contacts. And she went to the Lyceum school to study and to become an actress. She studied acting, and she also very quickly went on stage. She joined the Chautauqua circuit. She was part of the vaudeville scene. And she became involved in a very serious theatrical program, traveling across the country. She met Archie Bongé, who became her husband. You see Dusti here in a theatrical photograph. You get a sense of downtown Chicago, which was obviously a very big city then. And you see her on a photo set with other actors and actresses. She met Archie, who was a student at the Art Institute of Chicago, but someone who was a character as well, a cowboy, an athlete, a Westerner, who came to Chicago to study art. A very talented artist, and they would reconnect in New York. In 1924, plague, Topsy and Eva took her from Chicago to New York. She was on the stage there. She quickly became part of the theatrical world there in the city. She also became involved in movies, the silent movie industry as well, in Queens and beyond. And she met Archie again, who was studying at the Art Students League, and he was painting on his own, and he was working as a doorman. And you get a sense of Archie and Dusti, Archie in his doorman outfit. When they became engaged, as this headline suggests, handsome theater doorman wins a beautiful heiress. This to me was a surprising story because it caught on around the nation in 1928, and it became a national story that ran through the spring and the summer through the time of their wedding. And it did become a national story. Archie worked outside the Times Square Paramount Theater. He was a well-known local character. He towered literally over people, but he had his reputation as this handsome theater doorman article suggests, as a cowboy, an aviator, an artist, a dreamer. He was a character and a personality. So the two of them attracted a great deal of attention on their own. And while they were in New York, Biloxi continued to grow. The White House Hotel on a postcard above, the Edgewater Hotel below, built in this time, 1925 to 27, there were, about 5 major no hotels, including the Edgewater built, and it was a big hotel project, 400 rooms, 10 stories, a dance pavilion, golf courses, on, and it had its own railroad station as well. So they traveled back and forth between New York and Biloxi, and were married in Biloxi in 1928. And again, as we went through the archives and the files, we kept coming across all these articles and papers. The banker's daughter and the big handsome doorman, Dixie heiress engaged to artist. So the region and the country followed these events almost like something from a movie plot from the era. They married, they had their only child, Lyle, was born in 1929. And you see them as a very happy family here in New York on 22nd Street, an apartment up on the roof terrace. Dusti, small compared to Lyle. Dusti was fairly tall, but she wasn't as tall as as Archie rather, and there's small Lyle. And the painting by Archie is a view basically from where they're standing. It's of their apartment complex roof looking out over the city, and good images, childhood images, which appeared during the research process on young Lyle. As they went back and forth, they decided to move to Biloxi because of the Depression, because of the impact of the economy. And Archie began to really take in and sketch. On the lower right, you see the Fowler Factory, 1935, one of the many images Archie created of the factories, of the structures, the working environment, and a pile of oyster shells, both in his work and above. And those oyster shells created their own landscapes in ways. These mounds and mounds of shells were a key part of the landscape. They had done well in New York. They survived well. They were part of the art world there, but it was time to move to a new location, and Biloxi was that location. They bought this modest house on what was Pass Road and bought it for $600. Archie and a crew moved it back away from the street, and they created a little compound. He also then built a studio, this studio, which became Dusty's studio. Lyle's studio is now Paul's studio. And they created, in essence, a small compound. You see the edge of an addition here that Lyle later added. It was the period of regionalism in the American scene, so Archie had plenty of subject matter, the kind of thing Thomas Hart Benton or Grant Wood would be seeking out. It was there. It was all there. And he connected with his friends Walter Anderson and Paul Niñas. Walter Anderson, who lived nearby in Ocean Springs, was his friend, and Anderson was also the best man at their wedding. The house has been a center for the Bongé family ever since. When they moved there, Walter Anderson was completing these murals for the high school, and they're now in the Anderson Museum in Ocean Springs. So there was exciting work going on in the art world there. Anderson was doing it. Paul Niñas was working in New Orleans, and they went back and forth between New Orleans, Ocean Springs, and Biloxi. In 1936, rather dramatically, Archie became ill. They didn't know what it was. Eventually, after being in the VA hospital, he died in November 1936, very young. Some believe it was an early form of Lou Gehrig's disease that was undetected then. But suddenly, Dusti was a widow and a single mother. And in this time, she had decisions to make, and she decided to become a committed full-time artist. And what you see, and we'll see in the next few images, are some of her early works, a chicken, rather abstracted, on the left, and images of what she saw around town, somewhat different than the way Archie'd seen them. For her, she was more interested in a modernist, more cubistic view, and she begins to use color and form and style in her own way. You see a factory below, and you see some trucks above, and Dusty's style evolving from 1936 to 1939. You see some of those paintings and the scale of those paintings here as they were installed at the Ogden, along with some of the archival material in that case on the left. By 1940, she'd already had her first show in New York. The war years were here. Much of Biloxi was taken over by Keesler airfield. And you see a postcard view of troops on the base. You see women welders at Pascagoula to shipyard. This was a new era for workers, women, and others involved in the war effort. You also see an image of Bob Hope showing up with a crew, apparently entertained 10,000 troops on the field, 1943 at Keesler. And you see that self-portrait of Dusti from 1940, looking not at her face, but at her legs, at her feet, at a braided rug, at a doorway, at a scene. That's part of who she was. That's her house. That's her world. And we see her painting boats, shipyards, aspects of what's around her, but in a more modernist way. We also see Dusti taking, and the postcard view on the left, it's a little dark, but if you see there's what's called a shoe fly built around a tree. It was an elevated sitting viewing stand. That was a unique architectural form in Biloxi and along the coast, mostly gone now, but a few have been restored. She took that form with the stairway the railings, the architectural elements, the elevated position, and created the painting on the right, which is pretty much of an abstraction from that shoe fly, but from a real object place, architectural piece in a community. You see the stairs, you can see suggestions of trees, but you can also follow, as the 40s evolve, how Dusty's sense of abstraction is moving forward. You see it here too, in a very important work from the Mississippi Museum of Art's own collection called Where the Shrimpers Live. This is a great painting. It's one of her best early works. She was a rent collector, as was Archie, and she began to spend a great deal of time around the shrimpers, around the people who worked in these stores and factories, these shops and factories. And she knew them. She took her sketchbooks with her. She collected rent, she sketched, and she made impressions that she later turned into paintings such as this. And you notice how she takes those long houses, uses color, the lines, the fabrics, and creates a very distinctive view. Paul Bongé actually found this site. It's still there. The houses aren't, it's now a parking lot for a casino, but the site is still there and the trees are still there. As the war years advanced, her art advanced. She showed with galleries such as the early form of Betty Parsons Gallery. And in this decade from 1945 to 55, she really established her own imagery. We see a photograph of her working on the right, a photograph by Jack Robinson, a Mississippi photographer who's been getting a great deal of attention in recent years. And we see one of her large abstract works from about 1954 called Essence. She explored surrealism and created a series of works, figurative works, figures moving into abstraction surrealism like these called Keyhole People from in the 50s, showing abstracted humans, psychological states, mirrors, reflecting states of being. And you see some of the studies in a case below. There are lots of studies, lots of sketchbooks, lots of materials that show us how Dusty thought, how she worked, how she advanced. There are also images which appeared, some of these reproduced for the first time, such as this by Jack Robinson, who accompanied Dusty and Betty Parsons, seen on next to Betty, to Dusty in Mexico in 1954. Great documentation, a great trip, and one that Jack Robinson accompanied them and documented in a way that we're fortunate to have and find. There's a new book on Jack Robinson published by the University Press of Mississippi by Howard Smith. It's come out last year. Recommend that. And it's quite a document of New Orleans and his progress on to New York. Works in the 52, 53, 54 become mature, dusty abstractions. On the left, you see a portrait of Via Study, and on the right, a painting called Windows. And these, again, are the works we saw at the beginning. Windows on the left, the portrait of B, the full-scale work, is a portrait of Betty Parsons. Her first show in New York is 1956 at the Betty Parsons Gallery. It is a successful show. First one-woman show was in 1956. She shows every other year in that gallery, a gallery that was one of the best and most important galleries in the New York art world. Jackson Pollock was there, Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko, Ellsworth Kelly, Agnes Martin, on and on. It was one of the best galleries. At this time, when she was doing well and getting into that art scene, she was creating works that, again, fully explored her abstract expressionist skills and abilities. A work called Sail, for example, seen here in the installation, a large work that's part of the Ogden collection now. But she was encouraged to, again, to move to New York and to stay in New York and to become part of the art world in New York, where it was said she would become more successful, more financially successful, more connected, and more part of that scene. She tried it very briefly again, but it didn't work. And she returned to Biloxi because that really was her world, and it's where she worked and where her inspiration came from. Her second show in 1958 included works such as the one on the left, An Oriental If, but also the image that we looked at on the cover of the book, the sunflower image, which was also named as a tribute to Maggie, the woman you see in the photograph on the left, a friend of Dusty's from Biloxi. It was one of the series of what she began to call dream paintings. And Dusty literally had dreams and painted what her dreams delivered to her. This was a large one in those series. They became smaller as time went on, but she channeled her dreams and her visions from dreams into her big abstract paintings. This was one of the most important ones. And sunflowers were always important to her. She raised sunflowers throughout her life. And this is that painting by itself. And you can see how expressionistic it is. You can see the brush strokes, use of color, the emotional element, the excitement, and that dripping fluid element that reflects what many abstract expressionists were doing. She continues with the dream paintings like the one on the left, and she then moves into a new phase by the early 60s of shaped paintings. These are photographed in their yard by Lyle Bongé. You can see the house extension that Lyle himself added on one of Dusty's sculptures floating inside. And Dusty did not rest on her success as an abstract painter. She kept experimenting, which I think is rather remarkable. She didn't want to just repeat her successes. So she made these shape paintings, a wide range of shapes, 3 and 4 dimensional pieces that broke the wall and the plane. And then Lyle shows them in the setting of their fairly tropical looking yard. So these shows were successful in New York. After about 1965, Dusty began to spend less time in the New York art world. It seems to me, at least, that she had accomplished what she wanted to. She made her mark in New York. She still showed with Betty Parsons, but she also wanted to be back where she was from. She wanted to connect with their grandson, with Paul, to be around Lyle and her friends. So she spent most of the rest of the time, other than some travels, in the city of her birth. And we see her in the photograph on the right with many of the friends and associates who were part of that world. Paul was there, Lyle was there, Chris Steigerson, Karen Brown, Norwood Pratt, many of the people that became part of the environment, the social environment around Dusty, her house, her studio. The 60s and 70s were a lively time in Biloxi and in New Orleans and in New York. And Dusty was quite in the midst of that with her children, grandchildren, their friends. It was a lively time and a lively place. Many people from New York came to visit her there. Many people from Black Mountain College, where Lyle studied, came to visit him there. And it became almost a pilgrimage point. On the left, you see one of the fiberglass artworks that she made in this period. And here are 2 more. Again, experimenting. She's in her 70s now. This is 1975. And she's creating works that aren't just paintings anymore. These are works that were created in fiberglass. They're, in a way, windows. One might look at them as almost stained glass windows, but they were created first painting on fiberglass and then working with some of the friends and resources she and Lyle had on the coast. Bill Seaman, specifically, a boat builder and expert in carbon and fiberglass composites, taught her how to use the nature of the material fiberglass and to work her pigments into the fiberglass. So she created these remarkable images, these remarkable windows to be seen with natural light going through them. There are a series of these, and these were shown in her last exhibition at the Parsons Gallery. One of those windows was installed in front of the glass box windows like this at the Ogden, and you can really read and see how they work and the depth and the layering that she creates. Moving from her abstract expressions canvases is something very different. And again, by 1980, 82, you would have expected a woman who was approaching 80 to slow down. This last phase was, to me, perhaps the most interesting and surprising phase of her career. She worked in a series called Voids, but she also worked, as you see on the left, using Joss papers, papers that were found in Vietnamese and local markets around Biloxi in these years. They're small. This sheet is about 4 by 5 inches, and these usually with gold or silver squares in the middle. And she began to work extensively on this as one of her mediums. It is said that she was very much by this time, and she was under the influence of Buddhism and Buddhist concepts and principles, and that feeds in part into that. She also began to create large circular paintings known as voids, also inspired by Buddhism and the notion of the void in a very spontaneous, immediate fashion. These, again, are in the Ogden installation. They'll be seen in the Mississippi Museum as well in the installation. There's a series of these voids. They were done quickly, and they were done very spontaneously with that large circular void or vast empty space in the middle. At this time, the Dusti Bongé Portrait or Life of an Artist book came out, and there was a film made on Dusti as well by Educational Television. And the beginning of that film, which you can find on YouTube, shows Dusti painting the first of these void series. You can actually watch her work and how quickly she works in that studio, in that backyard there in Biloxi. I apologize, this has gone astray here. This is one of the last works in a collection of the Joss paintings behind this large painting, and two final major works, one called Passages, one called Big Red from 1987. She was 84 years old when she was painting these works, and she had this great burst of creative energy at the end of her life. The career that she'd started took many twists and turns, and I think in the 80s, in her 80s, she was also around many young artists. One of her closest friends was Joey Rice. Joey Rice was a paper maker and an artist, and they worked together, collaborated, challenged each other in ways, as Joey said as well. There's a show of Joey's work at the Dusti Bongé Art Foundation right now. And finally, the book and my reflections on this just tied things up with a look at her legacy, what came afterwards. And of course, one of the most obvious elements of that legacy is the Dusti Bongé Art Foundation, which is on the grounds of the Orr O'Keeffe Museum there in the city, but also her role as a woman artist, her influence in New Orleans, in Biloxi, in New York is important. The influence with her family is important. And the role she had in advancing awareness of abstract art in Mississippi and beyond is very important. The foundation is there in the cottage on those grounds, changing exhibitions using her collection. There's an exhibition of Joey Rice there now, as mentioned, directed by Dr. Elijah Romer, who was also a great supporter and helped in advancing this project. And I think with that, Chris, I'll turn it back to you.
That's great. Thank you.
Go back to live. I apologize for our technology, but I'm in Louisville and you're in Mississippi. And
no, that's fine. Well, we do have some questions. Let's start with one of the most basic ones. I may have missed it if you talked about this, but she was born Lillian Swetman. She married, and that's Bongé, but how did she get Dusti?
Apparently, it's a good question. In Chicago, in her theater days, it's said that she often had a dusty or dirty face and became a joke. She had to go wash her face after her performances or things. So it became a joke and she just became Dusti. So she kept that name and she liked it. I think it worked well for her in New York too. It gave her a personality. And throughout her life, I think Dusti, you could see Dusti was an actress. She had a presence. And even in the photographs, she was modest on some levels, but she did know how to pose and she did know how to have a character, a presence in the room, in an environment. Dusti probably fit quite well.
Yeah. How did she come to painting, to art? Did she have any training in college? Was it?
No, she didn't. And it's fascinating because she wanted to be an actress. That was her study. When she and Archie were together, Archie thought she had a natural talent, but Archie had gone to the Chicago Art Institute, the Pennsylvania Academy of Walter Anderson, Art Students League. He knew what art schools were. He was well trained, and he told her not to go to art school. He told her that it would take away her natural ability. It would take away her spontaneity. And she had to promise she wouldn't, so she didn't. She studied more or less, if with anyone, with Archie. And she worked with him in the studio. He taught her some basics. And the only time she actually went to any kind of art school was long after Archie was gone. And that was the Orleans Gallery art school in New Orleans in the 50s with George Dunbar and some of the other people who taught there. But by that time, she was already showing in New York. She was hardly a student, but she studied to be part of that environment. And she learned, she said things about the figure and working with a group. But most of what you learned was either through Archie or else it was self-taught. And I think when you look at the show and in the book, how quickly she accelerated from 1936 to 39, it's really rather amazing what she did and how quickly she learned.
Yeah, absolutely. So Archie was an artist, but their son was an artist as well.
Archie, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear your question.
You said, well, Archie was an artist and she learned from him, but then their son Lyle was an artist as well. Is that right?
Yes, very much. Lyle, best known as a photographer, but Lyle covered a lot of ground, as anybody knows Lyle did. And Lyle himself was quite a major character. He was a sailor, broke some records sailing. He was a builder. He did a lot of things. But Lyle went to Black Mountain College in the late 40s, and Arthur Penn was one of his roommates there. And he worked with Albers and others, and he saw a very interesting art world that allowed many boundaries to be broken. He came back, went to Korea, used his camera and became a photographer, and became well known early on, beginning in the 50s, with photographs of Mardi Gras, and spent much time in the French Quarter. But he also created a lot of abstract photographs in and around Biloxi and the Gulf Coast. And again, so you have mother and son working out of Biloxi, creating some very interesting abstractions, different media, but nevertheless looking at and seeing that environment in ways most people weren't seeing it.
Mm-hmm. And he helped handle her artwork later on?
He had something to do with that, and he helped set up the foundation. She stayed with Parsons through much of her career, and then she worked with other dealers, including some galleries in New Orleans and even in Ocean Springs. But Lyle then, and I knew Lyle for the last 10 years of his life, worked with him from the Ogden. Lyle also set up the foundation and did a lot to establish, maintain her legacy. And Paul Bongé, who's a photographer himself, is doing that now for both of them as well.
In fact, Paul has a comment in the live stream here, and he says, "The brown void is the first void. It was my birthday present that year."
How about that?
Yeah. A passing question about Archie before a secondary question. How tall was Archie?
Archie was, I think, 6'7".
Oh, yeah.
He was a very large man in every sense of the word, and the stories about Archie go on and on. I encourage you to read the book. I could only squeeze in the tip of the iceberg in a brief talk like this, but Archie came from Nebraska. He, as a young man at the age of 15 or 16, he spent a year on an Indian reservation as a cowboy. Apparently he was a sharpshooter. Lyle had a lot of stories about Archie shooting, whether it was appropriate or not, doing a lot of sharpshooting in a lot of places. There may or may not have been drinking involved in some of those events, I'm not sure. But he had a lot of skills, and he was very much a man of the West. So I think it's very interesting that a Westerner from the plains of Nebraska and Dusti, who was very much from the genteel South, found so many areas of common ground, which they did. And I think that Archie coming to Biloxi really helped Dusti see it in some new ways as well. He loved the water, he loved the lakes, he loved the wildlife, he loved the harbors, he loved the diversity of people. And it was subject matter that he was good at, and it was what people were looking at and really supporting in the 20s and the 30s in a way that was almost made for somebody like him. And then, of course, he connected back with his good friend, Bob Anderson, and what they were doing at Shearwater. They traveled together, they sketched together, they went to Horn Island together. And then Paul Niñas had moved to New Orleans in the 30s, his other friend, and Niñas is known for those murals in the Sazerac Hotel, of course. But he had almost a dream situation, and that he died so young in 1936 is remarkably sad.
You mentioned the genteel South. The headline, or several of the headlines, referred to Dusti Bongé as an heiress. How did her sort of family situation allow her? To what extent did her family situation allow her this career as an artist, and how did her works sell over the years?
Her work sold well through the Parsons Gallery, and sold comparably priced to what many artists were selling for in that period. Her family, it's an very interesting question about the family and the art, because her parents lived a long time. She came back and forth. Her parents saw at least the first show or two at the Parsons Gallery. And Dusti lived, it wasn't a bohemian life, but Dusti lived an artist's life, and came back to the city in the 30s with Archie. And there seems to be a lot of respect and support. And her father, who clearly had trouble with her being an actress, learned to live with her as being a successful artist over the years. But the abstraction was probably an interesting thing for him, the banker, to understand. But then when he realized how successful it was, and how she was reflecting what was the art of the time, and how it was working in New York galleries and the business part of that, I think that was there. And they were close. She was there in part, I think, to be around him in his later years. She moved into that cottage in 1962 or 63, right next to the big house where he was. So they were close up until the time of his death. And she, until her later years, used to go down to the bank, water the plants, and visit with people in the bank. So she was connected to the family business as well.
What about her mother? Did she die before the father?
Yes, somewhat before. And she, too, is a fascinating character from Louisiana. Her family is connected to back around Eunice, back to the history of their family plantations, and much of a presence in New Orleans, relatives there. So in her early years, she spent a lot of time going to New Orleans, knew the French Quarter, knew Uptown. They went shopping there. They knew the art world there. And this book this size could be just about Dusti in New Orleans and her family and her history and her art world there too.
Who were some of her major patrons or supporters? I mean, her work hung in private collections, at businesses, at galleries, and museums. I mean,
they're pretty diverse. What struck me is that after especially 53, 54, especially about 56, let's say, but even before that, she was being shown in a number of national museums across the South, in the West, in Texas, in Chicago, and other places. So she began to be known, seen, collected. She's in a great number of museum collections. And I think, one could travel to quite a few museums and cities and see examples of Dusti and her work. She also, excuse me, the image of the portrait of Betty is in the collection of the Women's Museum in Washington, D.C., which is a very important loan. Bradley did a great job getting that loan from Washington and including it in the show. It hadn't been seen for years. And I think there are probably quite a few of the smaller works, watercolors, which are just as powerful and important. The Joss paper pieces are all over, very easily transported and hung. And there are a number of major New Orleans collections, of course, who have their work. The Ogden has a large collection, Mississippi Museum, the Morris Museum in Augusta, Mobile Museum, and on and on. So she's in a lot of collections.
How would you situate her amongst the Gulf Coast artists who were her contemporaries and those who were before her? How does she fit into that mix?
It's a surprisingly interesting and diverse world that I think deserves even more attention. It's been getting attention, but when you think of Walter Anderson, the Anderson family in Ocean Springs, you think of the huge presence of George Orr. George Orr is just a giant, right, in so many ways. And there's a Frank Gehry Design Museum that reflects, some of that stature. But also Roland Barthes was there, the Woodward brothers, William, and both the Woodward brothers had a presence there. The Hudson family was there, and many people from New Orleans were coming back and forth. She was connected to many of them, and I think was seen as very collegial from everybody I talked to and interviewed. And in the New York art world, George Dunbar was very close to her, Gene Seidenberg. Many of the artists associated with the Orleans Gallery in the early modernist scene in the 50s and 60s were friends of Dusty's. One thing that stands out is she was very collaborative. She was very supportive. She encouraged her fellow artists, and she helped many of the artists from New Orleans and elsewhere, but especially New Orleans, get into the New York gallery scene. She also worked with someone like Joy Rice and treat each other as peers. And Joy was working with handmade paper, and Dusty wanted to know how to make handmade paper, so they did that. And then they went back and forth and challenged each other with paper or paintings or whatever. Many people, when interviewed, talked about her as having this, they try not to say Buddha-like presence, but they always end up saying something like that. She had this presence and this aura that encouraged and nurtured all sorts of things that maybe they wouldn't have done otherwise. And that was even said at her funeral, and that they weren't certain if she was a Buddha, but they all felt like they'd been in that presence in a way. So an interesting sharing character, and not what you normally hear about the New York world in terms of the cutthroat New York type of art world.
Right. Mississippi is made up of different regions, and for her era in particular, it seems to me, the Gulf Coast was much more connected to other parts of the Gulf Coast than other parts of Mississippi necessarily. Did she feel connected at all to other artists in Mississippi? And I mean, I certainly, it's hard not to look at her work and sort of think about similarities in the vibrant use of color with Marie Hull or someone like that.
Yeah. I think that's a very good comparison. I think about that too. Definitely that interest in color, the vibrancy, that awareness, that those forms of abstraction, but also think you're slightly different generations there. And I think you're also looking at the Jackson art world was in some ways its own art world, and maybe the center of the art world in Mississippi for much of that time. And she was there. I know the Anderson connection was strong. She had that. I'd like to take your question a slightly different way. I'm interested in how in Mississippi we look at something like, we know William Faulkner is a giant in so many ways and a presence as a literary figure, as is Eudora Welty. And with those figures who are internationally well known, not only are they from Mississippi and from the South, they are American icons, international icons in their field. Their homes are also pilgrimage points. Roanoke is a major place, a destination. I'm working on a project right now that includes a focus on Roanoke, and as is Miss Welty's place. On the other hand, most of the artist homes and studios are really not destinations. They're not places that we seek out. I would argue that not just with Dusty and Lyle and Paul's studio, but also what's there in Ocean Springs and Biloxi. There's a world of place, of studios, of inspirations that reflects a lot about them in a way that is very parallel to what we think of with writers, but we don't seem to think it as much about artists, but I don't know why. I think it's time to explore that some.
Yeah, absolutely. We are almost to the end of our time, but one question I have, you sort of touched on it during the presentation, but the variety of media that she used. I mean, the pastel work is phenomenal. Yep. Mixed media, the drawing, painting, sculpting, the fiberglass work. Can you talk to us a little bit about that range that she exhibited?
I think she used whatever she needed to convey what she wanted to convey. And I don't think she felt any constraint. I suspect that's part of what Archie was saying about not going to art school. She might have been told she couldn't do some of that. Mm-hmm. She didn't know she couldn't do it, or she didn't believe she couldn't do it. She could do it, so she did do it. And she also picked up that interest in fiberglass working on a boat with Lyle. Lyle was using fiberglass to repair one of his boats. She got interested in fiberglass. Bill Seaman showed her how to really use fiberglass. So suddenly she's working creatively with fiberglass. She also was apparently good at sewing. She made things out of sales, used sales from the sailing industry there. She was a poet. She was a writer. I think she was a very creative person, and however she needed to create and express herself, she did.
Thank you all for watching this with us today. Remember to join us next week for History is Lunch with Ralph Eubanks. Plus, there's a new Speaking of Mississippi podcast episode that looks at Mississippi's Union veterans and the fraternal organization, the Grand Army of the Republic. Don't forget, you can see many of these paintings that Rick has shown us today for yourself at the Mississippi Museum of Art's exhibit on Bongé, Piercing the Inner Wall. And our friend and viewer Scott Bradfield mentions in the comments section that Mississippi Public Broadcasting will be re-airing that special that Rick had mentioned on Dusti Bongé on Friday, April the 2nd at 8 p.m. So you'll want to make sure you see that as well. Once again, thank you, Rick Gruber, for this exploration of the life and work of Dusti Bongé. She's fascinating and sadly overlooked on at least the interior of the state. We appreciate what you've done, and we look forward to more from you in the future.
Thanks.